Hey everyone, welcome. Really glad to have you. Welcome to the Let's Talk event with the Inclusion Initiative. I'm Grace Foster, founder and CEO of the Inclusion Initiative. Really excited to have you all here. I have Joe Tulin here, my wonderful guest. Hi, Joe. How are you?
I am doing great. How are you?
Great. Thanks so much for making the time to be here.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm really excited for this conversation. So tonight we are wow, we're going to be covering a lot of things. So we are wrapping up National Adoption. Well, we have reclaimed it as adoptee, but National Adoption Awareness Month, and we are also wrapping up Native American Heritage Month as well. And so we're going to be talking about that in the context of sharing Joe's story and experience as a transracial, transnational adoptee, and just the multi intersections of identities that he holds. That is really impactful, right? To the showing how our experiences as adoptees, transracial adoptees, foster care alumni are so different, yet hold a lot of similar themes, right? About really how we want to honor our stories, have our stories be honored, have our heritage be honored, our cultures be honored, be included in all of these things. Because we're whole people just like everybody else. And just because we're adopted or experience foster care, it's not the only thing that defines us. So, really recognizing our intersectional identities is really important. So, I forgot to showcase this in the beginning. Sorry about that. So, here's more about our guest speaker. He is an intersectional environmentalist, DEIJ leader. Love the J in there for justice. He's Indigenous and queer, a queer activist, and also a transracial adoptee. So, welcome, Joe. Thanks so much again for being here. And to kick us off tonight, would love to hear a little bit about your background, your experience of growing up, however much you want to share or how little you want to share. And also, before you get started, sorry, Joe, for the audience, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love for you to engage with us. So if you submit any questions, please do so in the comments. You can react to anything that we're saying using the reaction buttons. Yeah, just be a part of the conversation with us. So we'd love to hear from you. So, Joe, going back to you, yeah, please share a little bit about your story, yourself, and what you want people to know.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction. All of it is really important. And it's funny, I always talk about how um, I have so many different identities and none of them define me, but they all affect like how I move through the world in so many different ways. And so I think a lot about that when I talk about what it's like being an adoptee, being a queer person, reclaiming my cultural identity, and all of those pieces. And so I will just start from the beginning, I guess. And again, feel free to stop me if you have other follow ups or anything. But I was born in Guatemala originally.
Uh-oh, Joe. Did we lose you for a second?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are.
Okay.
We lost you for just a second. Yeah, keep going.
Okay. um, but yeah, I was just sharing that I was born in Guatemala in the 90s, and Guatemala was just coming out of a civil war, and so it was a really rough time. I mean, that civil war in Guatemala killed hundreds of thousands of people, and most of them were indigenous folks in the country. Um, and so my birth mom, who I now know, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit, had to make the tough decision of like, do I try to take care of a child I'm maybe not ready to, or do I try to give him a better life? And, she decided to put me up for adoption. And so I was born in October of 1996. I literally 3 months to the day later was here in the United States um, with my adoptive family. And so I grew up in Maryland. And, it was, I would say, like a pretty typical, like middle class family. And I would say that I didn't really fit in with a lot of the people that I was surrounded with growing up. Um, I was in a community that was mostly white as a person of color. I was a queer person in a family that was conservative. um,
Mm.
and I didn't know really much else than that. I just knew I didn't fit in. And the older I got, the more that I think I started to realize that there were pieces of myself that just felt like they were missing or that I needed to dig into more. Um, I think something that's a little bit different for me is that, as a transracial adoptee, I knew that my parents were not my, biological parents. And that was apparent from a young age. And I remember when I was young, like saying things like, well, why did the kids in school say that, like, you're not my real parents? Because it was clear that they weren't, and people would comment on it. I remember them saying, like, well, you're not any different than anyone else, and like what kids say doesn't matter. Um, and the reality is that it did affect me and it did matter. And so it felt like I was in a lot of ways like told that like the reality of things other people were saying wasn't important. And that was hard for me. But by the time I got to high school, I was in a magnet program. So I didn't actually go to high school where I would have just based upon where I live, like most public school students do. And I went to a school that was a lot more diverse than like the school I would have gone to. And for me, that was like the first time that I realized that there were people that looked like me in maybe not super close to where I live, but at least like in the vicinity of where I grew up. And I really struggled with my identity for a long time. There are friends of mine who had said, like, in high school, you really were going through like an identity crisis, like, because you grew up in a white family. And so you tried to hang out with the white kids, and then that didn't really work. And then you were trying to hang out with the people of color, and that you were trying to navigate at the same time. And like, people saw it, I guess. They saw that I was like struggling to be like, where do I fit? And I took Spanish classes in high school. And I remember really particularly in one of my early Spanish classes, um, I had to do a project on like a country. And I was like, well, I'm going to do Guatemala because that's where I'm from and I want to know more about it. And I remember my parents, like they weren't like against it, but they kind of were like, well, why would you want to do that as the country, And the reality is, my parents were taught that if I was a child of a different race, like not to talk about that and not to act
Mm.
like it was different. And that was hard for me. And so that was kind of the first time where I was like, okay, this is who I am and I want to learn more about it. And I really kind of dug into it for a while. Like in Spanish class we had like nicknames that were Spanish, and like I chose my real name, my birth name, which was Jose, as like my nickname. And it was really affirming to like have kids say like, oh, Jose, like what's this, what's that, and like talk in Spanish. And it was the first time that I kind of felt like there were a couple of people who accepted me for who I was, which was like this little adopted kid who like didn't know any Spanish, but like was trying.
Yeah.
um, and that was really cool. And then I went off to college. And I feel like, to keep it brief, I just had a lot of stuff going on personally. and I got really depressed, and I had my own, I would say, like, drinking problems, and I kind of let that take over everything. And so things that felt good didn't feel good, and I kind of stopped my search for like who I was and like my identity. Um, and then the pandemic hit, which I don't know how other people feel, but like when you all of a sudden have to like be by yourself all the time, and like you're not going out to see people, and you're not, like able to fill your time with all of the things, like you really have to sit down with yourself and be like, who am I? And what am I doing with my life? And that was like the first time that I really started to get real about like my identity and who I am. I would preface that also by saying I was really lucky to have a boss at the time who I just trusted. And she was the first person to connect me with an adoption group that was focused on people from Guatemala. And this was like even before the pandemic, but I never interacted. Like I was part of the group and I was like, this is scary. I don't want to be involved. Like, I don't know these people, like, whatever. um, and so I just kind of like sat on the outskirts and like watched what people said in the group, and that was it. Um, and so then the pandemic hit, like I said, and I, for the first time, was starting to have this feeling that like maybe I'm trying to be someone that I'm not, and maybe it's worth just like cracking the door a little bit on like who I am, what's bothering me, and what I can do about it. And so the first thing I did was a DNA test, which um, I was luckily gifted it from a friend. I didn't have to pay for it. And this is like a personal feeling, but like I hate that like as adoptees, there is a lot of us who don't know our actual background and cannot find that information out unless we're like paying money to like
Yeah.
figure that out. And so I did the 23andMe test, and I remember the day I got the results back. I was like nervously awaiting them, but also I was scared. I was like, this is like the first time that I'm going to see like the true like background of who I am as a person. Um, and I probably put way more weight into it than I needed to, but like it was really important for me at that time. Um, and so I called my friend, we were on the phone, and I was like, these are my results. And what it showed is that likely with recent ancestry in Guatemala or El Salvador, um, it showed that I was 65% Indigenous American,
Wow.
which again was like something that, in my mind, it makes sense, but like I had never really thought about that indigeneity as part of who I was. And so when I saw that, I was like, okay, like not only am I from Guatemala, I also have really strong ties to an indigenous community there. And um and that's also like it really varies from adoptees. Like I've seen some adoptees who are a lot less indigenous and some who are a little bit more indigenous. And I would just say that like I don't know, for me it was like that number seemed pretty big. And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
um and that started the process for me of trying to learn more and trying to connect with other people who have similar experiences. So I got a lot more active in a group called Adoptees with Guatemalan Roots, which is amazing. And just kind of like starting to connect with people who were also part of the community, who had similar experiences. And that was really cool because I just, for a really long time, felt like growing up, I was completely alone. Like, my parents didn't understand me, kids at school didn't understand me. Like, it was very isolating for such a long time. And that got solidified in that process. And then, after going to the first conference, my first conference, they've had a couple, but I think it was in 2021, like maybe after the first wave of the pandemic hit. I mean, people were still getting sick, but it was like after the first big wave. And I went to the conference, which is in DC, and I live nearby, so it wasn't that hard for me to get there. And I just sat in the room with all of these people who looked like me, which also does not happen a lot.
No.
I am in a lot of rooms that are mostly white. And I looked around and I was like, oh my God, like these are my people. Like, I can't believe this group exists and that we're here. And a lot of the time at that conference was really just for people to share their story. What have you been through? What was it like growing up? Where are you at in your process? And there were some people that had talked about how they had started searching for their families. I think for me, it had always been there in my mind, but I never gave it the space to like take over like my thought process. But hearing that other people had done it, I was like, oh, maybe I can do it too. And maybe I can, connect with the people in my life. And so I was learning a little bit about how other people did the search. A lot of people were paying, frankly, like different private investigators money to go and find their family. I would say that I also felt very strongly, and I still do, that as an adoptee who really was sold for money because the Guatemalan government was selling children at the time, I shouldn't have to pay to like find my family. And so I didn't want to do that route of paying someone to go and find my family. And luckily around the same time, there's a group, and in Spanish it's called Consejo Nacional de Adopciones, which is like the National Center for Adoptions in Guatemala, who had just started this search like system where adoptees could for free give whatever information they had, which was more.
Yep. I think you're cutting out again.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, everybody. There we go. Yes, there you are.
Sorry, I usually don't have internet issues, so I apologize.
It's okay. It's okay.
But yeah, so I had sent over basically like the information I had. And I just waited. And I didn't know how long it was going to take. I didn't really know if it would work. Because the reality is there's people that are part of the group that I'm part of that like, they're never going to be able to find their birth families. They came up on dead ends. They found out that, their parents were told that they died in the hospital. They found out that somebody was paid to say that they were their parents that really weren't. Like there's so many scenarios that have led to dead ends. And I really thought that might happen for me as well. I had another friend who did it and he got his results back in like 3 months. And he found out that his birth mom was like living in the US now, like states, like pretty close by basically. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, I wonder what's going to happen. But then 3 months went by, didn't hear anything. 6 months went by, didn't hear anything. A year went by, I didn't hear anything. And I was like, maybe I'm not going to hear anything about where I'm from and if I can find my family. And about 1 month after the year mark, I got an email and it was basically saying, it was from the Guatemalan consulate here in Maryland, which is how I submitted my paperwork. And they said, hey, we have news. We would love to get on a call with you. And I was like, okay, like I have some time, like how soon? Like I have time coming up. And they were like, as soon as you're ready to get on a call. And so like literally that night, I got on a call with them and they were like, we found your birth family and we have some information to share with you. And your birth mom said that she is willing to meet and like gave us her phone number and you can just call her if you want to. Wow. And I was like, excuse me? Like, I was not like, And like I'm in therapy. I had talked to my therapist about this. And when that moment hit, I definitely was like, I am not ready for this. Like, here we are. And luckily, the consulate and the National Center for Adoptions was super helpful with like how to handle next steps.
Well, hopefully we get you back, Joe. Sorry, everybody. He's having some technical issues there. Okay, there we go.
All right. What's funny is I can hear you even when it's not working on my end. But anyway, so they were really helpful, and we got on the Zoom call, and they checked in with me first, like, this search is about you. We're here to protect you, and so if you don't feel comfortable for any reason, like, just let us know. um you know if there's things you don't want to share, you don't have to share them, all of the things. And then they brought my mom in to the Zoom call, and
Oh,
I remember that moment, like, looking at her, and she looks very similar to me in so many ways. And I think we didn't know what to say. Like, we were just like sitting here like in silence, like looking at each other. Um and there was a lot of crying, there was a lot of emotions. Um and I was going to Guatemala over the summer. So by the end of the call, I had said, well, I'm going to be in Guatemala in July. Like, if you all are able to meet, like, I would love to do it. And that was that. And then I went in July, and I got to meet them in person for the first time. And that was even more intense. Like, from a really young age, I remember like getting into fights with my adoptive parents, and like I would always like go to my room, and I would like try to think of what my birth mom looked like. Like, that was like a thing that I really intensely remember, was like something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, is like, what is my birth mom like, and who is she? And so like meeting her in person was insane. And the minute that she walked in and we hugged each other, like, the first thing she said was that she remembers holding me as a baby. Like, we were hugging, and she's like, I remember holding you as a baby. And I was like,
oh,
oh my God. And I like lost it. Like, I just started crying because, you know, I don't think I realized just like how special it is to like have that connection with someone. And, you know, I will say that like I love my adoptive family, and we're very different at the same time.
mhm,
And so like there are times where our interactions feel forced.
mhm.
Whereas like this just felt so natural in like a way that I almost can't explain. And so, there's a lot more that I could share, but I've been going on for a little while. So I'm gonna stop there for like my story, and we can go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that you shared all that, and I love like kind of the when it started and then what happened and now your reunion story, like all in one snippet. Because I think a lot of times, right, our stories get interrupted by the narratives of greater society, like whatever pieces they want to hear, right? That's what they're going to pull from us. So I love that you use this space to just share your story in its entirety. Well, semi entirety, but at least you had the opportunity to start from the beginning to your reunion story, because I think it's really important to show, right, how this really does impact our entire lives. The story doesn't stop when we become adopted or learn that we're adopted or whatever it is. And if you're a transracial adoptee, yeah, it's very obvious that you are adopted. So, it's always a constant looking in the mirror is a constant reminder that you're adopted. So we're living with it every day. And I wanted to back up a little bit to just some of the larger pieces you talked about. There's a lot, but one of the pieces that you shared that resonates a lot with me, right, is the never belonging. And I call it our in-between place. So
Yeah.
we don't fit in with well, in my case, white Caucasian parents. You too.
Yep.
Yeah, so white Caucasian parents didn't belong in that space, but was thrown into that world, right? The whole community I was in was very white. And then when I started really meeting other Asian Americans or even international Asians, right?
Mhm.
And tried to build rapport, community, friendships on that end, I didn't fit in there either. And it was just this weird thing where I'm like, okay, I look like you, but I act like you. And so I don't belong anywhere here. And it's a lot of transracial adoptees that get adopted into communities, especially like whole communities, not just families, but also whole communities that don't reflect them at all and obviously don't celebrate their heritage at all. Like there's so many of us that kind of sit in this weird in-between space, and I wasn't able to name that until I hit my 30s, like mid 30s. I was like, whoa, like I knew it, but I didn't have like words or language for it until, the last few years, because when we are able to fully share our stories and tell our truth and meet each other in community and understand like what the narratives are that have been driving like our mindsets our entire lives, only then are we actually able to have words to like describe what we're feeling and what we've experienced. So I just wanted to name that. I think that's really important. Another piece was, we're talking about how it's a weird place to sit in these months. National Adoption Awareness Month. It was to celebrate adopters, and with an emphasis on people that are adopting from foster care. And for the Heritage Month that we're celebrating, it is also a weird month, right? Because it's not honoring the broad diversity that is within these ethnic groups, right? So it's, I think, especially as transracial adoptees or as foster youth of color that are placed into white homes and white communities or communities that don't reflect them, these things just really stand out to us. And we feel them very deeply. And, it is important to know the histories of these months. I mean, these months were created by white people that don't have our lived experience. And I've talked about this on my social pages of the origin of, especially National Adoption Awareness Month. Started by white men in politics that, they used it to like elevate their own, platforms, and maybe not intentionally, but that's kind of how this was used. And of course they had like good intentions. Everyone has good intentions, but what really matters are the results of those intentions and the actions. And what happens, right? What happened was that it helped reinforce this narrative of how to resource and support the adopters, the parents, and the agencies and the organizations. And it left adoptees and foster youth kind of like in this little box of, okay, you exist literally for this purpose, so that adopted parents, organizations, and agencies can save you. So like that like unfolds right into what you were talking about, even to learning what your true heritage is, and like why that's such a big deal, like why it means so much to us, because our origin stories are literally created for us verbatim, like on a piece of paper. And like, that's what we get as our origin story. And so these things, like when you were talking, it just really resonated with me, these specific things, because I think no matter what our experiences as adoptees and foster care alumni, I think these are some of the through lines for like really big pockets of our community. So I just wanted to name that. And now that I shared some of my thoughts around, our lived experience, I'd love to hear from you a little bit. Just in the story that you shared in your life experience, on the topics of adoption and foster care and what that means to you, like, what do you think is like it's hard to pick one, but what is one of the key takeaways that you'd want folks to know, especially folks that don't have the lived experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a hard one for me to answer. And I'll explain why, and then maybe I'll get to the answer. But
Yeah.
I think when you're adopted, and especially because there's so many different types of adoptees and adoptions and situations that happen, a lot of times the narrative, the popular narrative, I guess, is that like you were saved for whatever reason. And for me, I will say this always is like, we have a different story now. And my story, however it might have been had I not been adopted, is not reality. And there's no way for me to compare what my life would have been like if I wasn't adopted to
Mhm.
what my life was because I was adopted.
Yeah.
And so that narrative around like being a savior and having that piece is just like not true. And so I think for myself, I heard growing up, like, you should be grateful, like you're not starving in like a country that is unsafe. And like, it's unfortunate that those were things that I heard. But the reality is like that narrative is used to kind of control how I was acting as like a child.
Yep.
And that's just not okay. And so I think the biggest thing about lived experiences for us as adoptees is like, if you don't have that experience, like listen to those that are sharing their story and listen to adoptees specifically, because even in the narratives that are coming out, there's a lot of times where like adoptive parents are speaking for their children, and like that's also kind of problematic. And the reality is like, and we've both said it, like most people don't understand my experience. I don't fit in a lot of places. And so when I do choose to share about my experience with people, like it's probably because A, I trust them, and B, like I want to help educate around what the problems are in the popular narrative. So I don't know if that fully answered the question, but like that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah. I mean, I 100% agree with you. Listen to adoptees and center them in the storytelling.
Yep.
And that is like still one of the biggest, I guess, uphill climbs we have as a community, is having us centered when adoption is talked about or when foster care is talked about. So yes, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And jumping forward a little bit, I want to revisit just some of your experience of meeting your birth family
Mhm.
and highlighting adoptees with Guatemalan roots, because it's a really great organization. Ben, one of the co-founders, he was interviewed here on this
Yeah.
platform by me last month, and it was
Yes.
awesome. Yeah, he has a really great story. He has a very interesting reunion story too. But I'm so impressed with how, I mean, it's not perfect, right? But I'm impressed with how Guatemala is trying to take responsibility for what happened, trying to provide resources at, their, like, the national level, and not putting it on the adoptees to like resource themselves, right? They're like, we did this to you, so we're here trying to provide X, Y, and Z. Even like to the point of like, you get to vote in this country. Like, you still have a say in this country. Like, you're a part of our country. You get to vote. That's really cool.
Yep.
I can't do that in South Korea.
Yeah.
Like, let alone, like, I mean, the citizens of South Korea like would not recognize me as, a part of their community because I'm adopted. So the fact that Guatemala is like normalizing that adoptees are still Guatemalans and they're a part of the community and they get rights in the country, that's really cool. So, but anyway, I learned all that from Ben, and it was very, very inspiring and enlightening, and hopefully more and more countries are moving in that direction. But I wanted to ask if like they had been a part of your journey in the birth search, and like, I guess why and how you decided to do that. If you want to talk about it. If you don't, please please don't feel like you need to, but would love to just learn, like, I guess just some of the inspiration for that beyond, right? I mean, we all want to know what our moms and dads look like, and I still do too. But I haven't done a birth search, and like, I'm not at that place in my life where, that's something I'm looking to do. But kind of like you said, right? It's like just knowing what your mom looks like, but then you got to see that and just live that moment for the first time. I mean, it's just like, I don't even know what I would say either. Even if I got to see a picture, like, I think I would be staring at it for a really long time. That's incredibly special. But it's really scary too, because like it grounds you in reality. Like, oh, yep, this is like where I come from, and this is my parent, and like, this is my story, right? And for me, for a long time, especially growing up, I was always wanting to make my history like a fairy tale, because it gave me more hope than the truth that I was living in. Because my experience was not good, so I would always fantasize about my birth family and my birth mom, and like that I was a princess, and that I had some amazing like hidden identity. I think a lot of adoptees and foster youth go through that. And obviously I don't think that anymore, but it got me through some really hard times when I was growing up. And I think that would have all been shattered, right, had I seen like an actual picture and like, oh yeah, they were middle class or working class people in Korea, like, just would have shattered the whole dream. And not everyone is like ready to do that. So I'm curious what your journey was like towards that decision.
Yeah. I mean, I really relate to what you just shared about like not knowing let me continue to fantasize about what it could be. Like, that's something that, like, honestly, like, I had conversations with my therapist about, was like, and it really, like, and I'm going to boil it down, but give more context. Like, it really got to the point where I was like, I can either do this and maybe have to accept things that I don't want to, or I can continue to like wonder and just like never get closure. And like, that's the thing that like, I think I really had to grapple with, like, was I ready to like face some of this stuff? And for me, I will admit, and I touched on this a little bit, like, I struggled with drugs and alcohol for a while, for part of my life. And what really has helped me, and this is my story, is like, I got sober and I still don't drink or use drugs. And that is how I choose to live my life. And in that process, like, part of working a program in that space is like letting go of resentments and like trying to just like tackle the things that like are impacting your life in different ways. And so for me, I remember like when I first got sober, like I was angry and I was mad that like my birth mom decided to like give me up because, you know, I also struggle with my adoptive family in a lot of ways. And like I too had just kind of always had this mindset that like things would have been better for me if I was with my biological family. And I had to work through a lot of that. It was like therapy and working with a sponsor and like all of these things to like unpack why I was angry and trying to let that go. And so, you know, it kind of got to this point where I just like really had to be honest with myself and say, do you want to stay in the dark forever? Or do you want to find out and maybe like have news that you don't want to deal with? Because starting that search also meant that like, yes, maybe I could find them and maybe they're amazing, but like maybe I won't be able to find them and I will never be able to find them. And will I be ready to like accept that as like a possibility? And for me, like I went back and forth about that for quite a while. And the reality was like I just started to be confident in like who I was as a person. And so like similar to identities, like for me, whether I find my birth family or not, like I am still who I am and I can live my life and have support and have like networks of people that will take care of me. And like that helped me know that whatever happened in the situation, like I have a group of adoptees to talk about. I have a group of people who are sober I can talk about it with. I have friends who maybe aren't adopted, but like do care about me as a person that will uplift me through that process. And when I found out that they wanted to meet, like that was like one like amazing, cool. Like they found them and they want to meet. But then came like the next wave of like feelings for me. And I want to explain it because it also touches on being queer in this situation too, because I also have done a lot of work about being a queer person. And again, I grew up in a conservative place where like it wasn't okay. And so I also am at this place with that identity that like I know who I am and I'm comfortable with who I am. And I couldn't say that for so long. Like I just couldn't say it. And so when I found out that they wanted to meet, a lot of people in Guatemala are also just fairly conservative. It is not a safe country to be a queer person. And I then had to go through the process of, do I meet my family and just show up as Joe where I'm not visibly queer and I don't talk about it? Or do I put it all on the table and say, this is who I am? And if you are not able to accept me, like, I can't have that relationship. And that scared me because here I am doing this search that like I've been wanting to do for decades at this point, and also knowing that I might share all of who I am and not be accepted. And that was so scary. And I just had to know, again, very similarly, that if they don't accept me, that doesn't change who I am, you know? And like it really it boils down to like, am I confident in who I am? And I do feel like that now. And you know, I did come out to them. And my mom still messages me every single day just saying like, I love you, I hope you're okay. And it was crazy, like the like honestly, like even now that I look back that I did that, I'm kind of like, that was crazy. Like in the documents that I got, it said that my mom was evangelical. And when you're talking about religions that are not accepting of LGBTQ plus people, that's pretty not accepting. And even when so we had a translator. I know some Spanish, but it's not perfect by any means. And when I told the translator that I wanted to tell them that I was gay, he literally stopped and said, "Are you sure?" You know, and he said, "Because I can tell them after the call ends if that makes you feel better." And I remember just saying, like, no, I need them to know, because if they're not okay with it, like, I'm not interested in continuing this conversation. And he said it. And like, it took a second or two. And then the response was like, well, God made you that way because that's how you're supposed to be. And I love you no matter what. And like, that is not the experience I had with my adoptive parents. And so like it's just crazy. And then I think about like being adopted and her not knowing like literally anything about where I was for 26 years. And I wonder if that played into it. Like, if I grew up there, would she have accepted me? I don't know. Like, maybe not. But in the moment that I came out to her, she had to decide, like, do I accept my son for who he is, or do I risk not getting to know him at all? And she chose to accept me. And so, like, that was another place where, like, I wasn't sure if I was ready to do it, and I did it. And here we are. And so I would just say that process took a lot of conversation with people, took a lot of unpacking with a therapist, like all of these things. But at some point I just knew I was ready, you know, and that was how I got to that decision.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot put on us
Yeah.
to navigate and make these really big, big decisions, because you had to come out twice in like really big ways to parents who were like, yeah, it's I'm processing this in real time, right? Because like it continues to amaze me, not in a good way, of
Mhm.
how much of the burden is on us to
Mhm.
navigate, to share, to and almost like create, right, this culture, these norms for
Mhm.
us. But we were the ones that were taken
Yep.
away. So
Yep.
it's just this weird place that we have to be in all the time. But you know, you navigated it in a way that honored you and who you are, and I really admire that. Thank you for sharing that.
Of
It's
course.
beautiful. And like your birth mom's just the story of how your birth mom reacted, right, is like so poignant. And it's I wish every single story was like that.
Yeah. Me too.
I'm really glad that that is your story.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for diving into that part of your experience. And I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about the workplace. Because
Mhm.
as you know, right, the Inclusion Initiative, we're really here for the not sole purpose, but our main purpose is to close the opportunity gap for transracial adoptees and foster care alumni.
Yep.
Most of us are people of color. And we are put right into families, communities, situations that just do not reflect us, don't honor us, don't honor our heritage. And like we talked about earlier, right, we're always in these in between places where we don't ever quite belong. This really impacts us everywhere, but I have felt it so strongly in the workplace. And I'm really interested to hear from you, because you do DEIJ work. You have intersectionality with different ethnic communities, but also with the queer, LGBTQ plus community. I'm sure you have seen a lot in your years in the professional space.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm curious to hear like why you do the work you do. I mean, I can make assumptions. One of them is that you're a very good person and you care about our planet and our communities. Amazing. But, it's our journeys are so unique in how we get to where we are. So I'd love to hear like why you do the work you do, how you feel like your intersectionality of these different identities like really strengthen, right?
Mm-hmm.
The work that you do and the impact that you have. And like as a transracial adoptee, an international adoptee, transnational adoptee, I guess, have you ever thought about those identities and how they impact you in the workplace?
Yeah. I think it's so funny. Like I've been thinking about this question, and I'm like, where do I start? I guess I'll start with why I do the work that I do, and that's something that like I say it all the time. Like I do a lot of this hard work because like I don't ever want anyone to feel like they don't belong and they don't have a support system and that they don't matter, because the reality is I felt like I didn't matter for so long in my life. And it took a really long time for me to say, actually, like, you're a good person and you are more than like society says that you are. And you can have impact by sharing your story. And so, like, that's why I do the work that I do, to boil it to something like a really brief thing. But what I can say is that, like, the work that I do in a variety of spaces is hard. And I do different things in different spaces. So, like, outside of my day job, I spend a lot of time advocating for the LGBTQIA plus community. And I live right now in Maryland still, in a community that I would venture to say is like very purple if we're talking about like politicalness. And so like being openly queer still can feel hard. Now it's not super conservative in all spaces, but it can still feel hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about like my identity as like a pretty openly queer person. Like I have nails that are super painted all the time and like things like that. Um and like that has definitely affected like how I move through the communities that I'm part of, how I show up, as the chair of a board in this area. And sometimes I think it affects like the level of respect that other people might have for me as a person, or lack of. Um in my day job, and I will say that like I'm going through a shift right now, and I haven't posted it on LinkedIn yet, so people that are watching this get like the sneak peek that I'm starting a new job in about a week from tomorrow.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So I'm going to an organization that really centers uh Latinos. And also the work that I'll be doing is like national for frontline marginalized and communities of color, which is like bridging like all of my personal interests with like my work interests. And
Wow.
like that for me is like so exciting because like in my work, I've always so I started out of college at a funder organization, like an organization that has money and they're giving it away to other organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I still to this day like work at an organization that gives away money. They're a funder. And a dynamic that always exists in those spaces is that like there are some times where I am like the only person of color in a room. We're part of a funders network that it's me and this woman named Benita. We're usually the only two people of color in the room. And that work and like doing it well is so important for me. And so even at my current job, like one of the DEI things that we've been working on is like making sure that communities that we're serving are represented in our review committee, and that those communities are actually getting some of the money that we're putting out the door. And in the last, like, a little bit over a year that I've been at my current role, we've seen that. We've seen that the amount of money going to underserved communities has increased. More people of color and women and non-binary folks are part of the review committee. And like, knowing that people trust me in that space is really cool, because the reality is I understand a little bit of like what it's like to grow up in a white household and how to like talk even to certain people. And now that I've accepted who I am as a person of color, as an Indigenous person, and as a queer person, I also can like talk to some of those communities and like bridge those gaps.
Yeah.
And that's really cool. And that's where I think my skills really come into play in the workplace, which is awesome.
Yeah, I had to take a big deep breath because I was in the nonprofit sector for over 10 years, and I was on the opposite side. I was on the grantee side and fundraising on the front lines, right, for marginalized communities. And how money is determined and to what orgs and why and when and how is all driven by people that don't share the lived experiences, don't share the identities of the folks. And it drove me up a wall. And we really, really need nonprofits doing this work. And I'm really happy that there are so many philanthropists that want to invest and do good in the world with the resources they have. We got a long ways to go, though. We need more and more and more and more and more people with lived experience running these organizations, on the boards of these organizations, at the funder seat of these, for these organizational reviews of who gets funded, all of these things. So I'm glad you have one of the seats at one of those tables.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy to hear like that people are valuing you, because it's so important. And I built the Inclusion Initiative, still building it, as a social impact company and not a nonprofit, because I have seen firsthand for 10 years the harm that happens with philanthropy not considering like the lived experience, right, of those that they are serving.
Yeah.
And how nonprofits can really get into trouble with needing the money, yet the money they're being given is not aligning with their mission and values. It's just, we got some work to do. So thank you for being on the funder side of the table, really advocating for some of that change. That's really, really important. And we need all of us, right? We need nonprofits, we need government, we need private, we need philanthropy, and we need organizations like mine, social impact companies that can do the work that nonprofits can't always do, and vice versa. And yeah, it's just a really big ecosystem. And speaking of a big ecosystem, so one of my questions to you, right, was asking if and how you've ever considered or needed to navigate or anything like that about your adoption identity in the workplace. I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, I think, where it shows up the most, if I'm being honest, is like in how I show up in some of the spaces more than having to like explain my adoption. And that's something that like I think has been challenging in a couple of ways. So, because of my background, and I don't want to like broadly say all adoptees are like this, but a lot of adoptees are people pleasers, because I think we're always told like, you're not enough. And so like then my brain goes to like, well, how do I prove it? And how do I do more? And how do I be the best worker amongst workers? And like that has meant that like typically I really struggle with work-life balance. Like I really I want to do the best that I can. And like, I've seen, more recently that like, that makes other people uncomfortable sometimes. Like, this person works so hard and they're like changing how we as like an organization feel like our relationship like like it was like changing how people with the organization felt like they should be working and should they be working harder, and like that's
Mhm.
weird to like hear that feedback also. um and it's also meant that like in the last year I've really like there was a lot that happened, I guess, but I've also really tried to go back to this like I can work 40 hours a week and do the best that I can and then like leave the rest. And that has been really hard for me.
Mhm.
I will also say, because I know what it feels like to like not feel seen and heard, I am a lot louder now when I see that people are not being included in conversations. And so like as I'm sure a lot of us know, like there are certain people that might take up a lot of space in our organizations. And there are some people that might have good ideas that just don't know when to speak up or don't know when to share. And I try very hard in those situations to A, like make room for myself, but B, ensure that I'm also making room for other people that might not have the space to share what they're thinking. And so that has definitely, I think, been a challenge for some of the people that I've, tried to say, like, hey, I think this person's trying to speak, or I think this person has an idea. And so, like, navigating that space of like making sure that other people feel seen and heard, like, that's super, super important for me in the workplace. Um, and I think I am somebody, and like this is something that I struggle with still, and it's something that I can work on. Like I'm the type of person that like I also need constant encouragement that like I'm doing well. And I really struggle with feedback. So
Mm.
like if I didn't do something right and I need that feedback, like immediately I'm like, well, but blah blah blah. Like I feel like I have to explain it. I feel like I have to like, like defend myself like very strongly. And I've learned a lot about like, there are times where like I can get really worked up about things that like in reality are not that important. And like I can still accept feedback as like a way for me to continue to grow and like improve as a person. And so like that's like a very real thing for me right now of like, you know, uh I can accept feedback sometimes and like it's okay, and like um so that's been like a newer realization in that space. But I would say those are some of the ways in which like being adopted has affected me that has then affected me in the workplace.
Yeah, it's I think it's true for many, many people, especially adoptees, because you're right, right? Those really mainstream dominant narratives about how grateful we should be and how we should behave and what our lives should look like and what our relationships should look like, right? And it's all centered around, to your point, people pleasing and being grateful. And it really does impact us when we get into these spaces where we have performance evaluations and bosses and goals and metrics and all of these things. It just like really highlights that for us. And I really appreciate you sharing that and being a little bit vulnerable, because it's important for us to hear like we have similar struggles in these areas. I also struggle with that, Joe. And I don't think it's uncommon at all. And it's, again, part of why I'm building my platform and this community and resource. I really hope you'll be a part of it, and you'll be actually happy to hear like one of the courses that we're going to have is navigating people pleasing tendencies as a transracial adoptee and or foster care alumni. because those are super strong instincts and habits for us. And so like, how do we combat that so that we're honored and we're respected and we can draw boundaries, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And if folks have questions, please do feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll be able to see them on LinkedIn. But while we wait for that to happen and give folks some time to write up their questions, I would love to hear from you, from your perspective, Joe. Like, what do you think, like in general, for our transracial adoptee community, like, what do you want people to know that you think is the most important or impactful way to support us?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that is easy, and then I might go into like some other things that aren't as easy, but like the biggest thing is just like listening to your friends and checking in on them, like just to give like an example, like during the pandemic, when there was really like a bigger spotlight on the race issues that are going on in this country, like it's been going on forever, but when the pandemic first started, obviously, like the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Adam Toledo, like really spotlighted this. And my adoptive family never thought to check in with me about like how I was processing and how that was affecting me. And the reality is, like, as a person of color, especially, and I remember for me, and particularly, it was Adam Toledo, who is Latino, like, that really affected me. And like, I had friends who were checking in, and my own family, like, wasn't. And so, like, just being there and like checking in, because you never know what might, affect somebody, is really important. I think the other piece here that I continue to say is like, as a queer person, as an Indigenous person, as a Latino, like I've really struggled with letting myself accept those as my own identities, and having friends there that remind me that like society's views of like these identities of mine don't matter. Like I can just be me and be all of those things. Like that is so important and so helpful in like my evolution, like because I have like a couple of like white friends, for example, that like know Spanish very well, and they're like, Joe, we're just going to talk to you only in Spanish, and I don't like it in the moment, but like it helps me like accept my identity and practice some Spanish. And so like it's so weird the like ways that you can do that. I would also say, and this is a little bit more on the Indigenous side as we're wrapping up Native American Heritage Month, like there are a lot of really great organizations who are working in this space. And I wanted to uplift like one group that I've worked pretty closely with called the Mayan League. And they are really in like the DC metro area doing a lot of work, but they do a lot of work that's kind of well known throughout the country in like supporting Indigenous communities here in the United States and in our area. And the woman who runs it, Juanita, is like amazing. And so like supporting like Indigenous led and queer led organizations, transracially led organizations, like all of those things financially. And if not financially, it's like, just share the stuff. Like, you have a platform and you have a reach, and like share whatever they're doing, because it's hard for a lot of us to do this work. And like sharing something is like super easy, and it can show that like, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing and I care. So
yeah,
I'll stop there. But yeah.
No, that's a great point. I love that you just simplified it for folks that don't know all the time, like how to support, right? Because it seems like we have to make these big grand gestures, but it can be something as simple as just sharing about an org to your own network. and helping them gain some visibility, right? So no, I love that. I got a one DM, and the question, Joe, for you is, with your birth mom, are there like new traditions you're creating as a reunified family?
Yeah, I don't know that we're there just yet. I certainly hope there are. Like that's something that like I have thought a lot about. And so like um I would say like it's something that I wouldn't say is like a tradition yet, but like I've been thinking a lot about is like my mom's birthday is pretty soon after like I had initially met her. And so like
Wow.
for me to be able to just like send her a message on her birthday and say like, "Hey, I hope you have a great birthday." Like that was really powerful for me. And very similarly, like when my birthday came around later, which my birthday's in October, like my mom, like she messaged me, and her message was like even more heartfelt than mine was to her. But it was like, happy birthday! Like I'm so like you are like the biggest gift that like I've ever gotten, and like even on your birthday, like I'm celebrating that. Basically, is what she said. And so like those are two things that have been like the small thing of just like a birthday is like super meaningful. um I would say I'm like going to be real for a moment. Like for me, I have been struggling a little bit with the reunion. Like it's been great and I don't want to like ignore that, but like also my Spanish is still a little bit rough and they don't speak English, and so like communication can be hard sometimes. And
Yeah.
so I'm working on myself, like learning a little bit more Spanish. And I certainly hope that as I do that, we'll get into the space of like maybe having more of those traditions.
Yeah. No, it's important to honor that. And, our mutual friend Patrick Armstrong talks about a lot, right? He talks a lot about how two things can be true at once.
Yep.
And that's a really like common saying in society, but really, really, really relevant for our community as adoptees and foster care alumni. Like, yeah, two things can most absolutely be true at once. You can be really happy and joyous about your reunion and getting to know your birth family. And it can also be really hard, and you can have struggles at the same time with it. So, no, I think it's important to name that. And like, I really appreciate you sharing that piece of it, because that's exactly what we're trying to do, right? As a community, we're trying to dismantle like these popular narratives about what our experiences are. We're trying to tell our truth and honor our truth. And so with that, I think it's a great way to wrap up both National Adoptee Awareness Month. I'm officially renaming it. I don't care if it's
I love it. I support it.
Adoptee Awareness Month, that you shared your truth and you shared your story and you honored your lived experience and all of your identities, right? And also wrapping up the Heritage Month that means so much to you. That is a big piece of like your like blood, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also now a big piece of like your culture and like how you see yourself in everyday life and at work and everything else. So, and especially your advocacy work. That's really important. So I loved having this conversation with you. I love sharing this space with you. Thank you so much for just sharing your story and helping like those that are listening, those that will be listening, helping everyone just know that it's really okay to share your truth, and it's celebrated.
Yep.
We've been so scared to do it for a long time, but like the more and more conversations I'm able to have with people just like you with our lived experience, I think we're starting to like dismantle some of those fearful walls that we've all put up. and finding each other too. That's like so important for our community, is finding each other and sharing these stories together. So yeah, thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate the work that you're doing in the philanthropy space, in the advocacy space, in the justice space. It's really awesome. You're a pretty awesome person, Joe. So,
Thank you.
And for anyone that's interested, we have, hold on here. We've got information on how to reach out to Joe. So his Insta is linked there. Same handle, right, for X. I'm
AKA
finally
Twitter.
saying it right. I was saying Twitter for a long time. For X.
Yep.
And if anyone wants to get in touch with Joe, there he is. Please reach out. Inclusion Initiative, please keep in touch with us. Please check out our platform. And we're just so excited to continue to be in community with all of you. So with that, thank you, everyone. Good night.